Live streaming is on.
All right, I'll go ahead and convene the Sherwood School District Budget Committee today, June 1st, 2020. Our first order of business, well, welcome everyone, and our, or whatever the right word is when you're where you are and I'm where I am and we didn't actually go anywhere, but in any case, our first order of business is to elect a chair for the Budget Committee. Are there nominations for chair of the Budget Committee?
Mr. Chair, I would nominate Nicole Brutowski as chair of the Budget Committee.
All right, we'll consider Nicole Brutowski nominated. Are there any other nominations for chair of the Budget Committee? Seeing and hearing none, I'll go ahead and close nominations and ask all those in favor of electing Nicole as the chair, please say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Very good. Then Nicole Brutowski is the chair of the Budget Committee, and I will turn the virtual gavel over to her.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I was hoping for an actual gavel, but I'll take a virtual one. So I will go ahead and start the meeting off by just reviewing the roles and responsibilities of the Budget Committee. So just a reminder, the following defines the scope and responsibility of the Budget Committee as a whole. A Budget Committee is a group of school board members and citizens that reviews the school district's proposed budgets. The committee is composed of school board members and an equal number of citizens. The Budget Committee is the means for the public to participate in the budgeting process. The public is encouraged to attend because one of the most important purposes of the committee is to take comments and questions from interested citizens. The Budget Committee receives the budget message and the budget documents from the superintendent. The committee reviews the proposed budget, listens to comments from citizens, and then approves the budget. The Budget Committee reviews the proposal to ensure that the district is planning to spend money in furtherance of expressly stated district goals. The committee reviews the budget at a public meeting. The committee approves the budget at the major fund and function level and sets the tax rates. Once complete, the Budget Committee refers the budget to the school board. The school board adopts the budget. The Budget Committee does not approve new personnel, set salaries, benefits, or contract terms for employees or for administrators. It is outside the committee's scope of work to set staffing levels or to decide whether or not a service or program should be provided. The Budget Committee does not make district policy, and the Budget Committee's work is completed after it has approved the proposed budget. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cordy for the superintendent budget message.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your service here this evening and through this process. We, a few years ago, realized, thanks to Chair Allen's really poignant question about the reading of the superintendent's budget message, we have moved away from me reading that verbatim, thankfully, and that is part of the proposed budget that is before you this evening. But instead of that tonight, there are a few thoughts that I would like to share with you. So if I could just take a few moments to do that. I'd like to first take us back in time a little ways back. To our March 11th board meeting. And many of us here were a part of that meeting. We were in the Ridges community room. And we were so excited because that evening, Mr. Bennett presented the highly anticipated student investment account application. That award amount is nearly $4 million after months and months of stakeholder engagement and forums and surveys and conversations with staff and parents and students. Really clear priorities were emerged, and they were consistent across truly all of the stakeholder groups. focuses on mental and behavioral health and expanded services at the Share Center and so many more. And thanks to the corporate activity tax, for the first time in our careers, funding for K-12 education would be at levels that we had only ever dreamed of. We were right at the precipice of being able to add over 30 new FTE to our district. And those, truly were exciting and unprecedented times. And literally at the same time as that meeting was happening, in that same room, there were individuals who were receiving information or signals that there might be potential short-term school closure due to COVID-19. And we immediately started preparing for what that might mean. And sure enough, within the next couple of days was an announcement of a closure until April 1st. With March 30th and 31st, I believe, being identified as some professional development days. Then later, an announcement of closure through the end of April. All the while, our staff and our leaders were working around the clock, truly, in some cases, to prepare to deliver distance learning for all. And then ultimately, all school facilities closed for the remainder of the year. I'm going to pause for a second. Christine, can you please reach out to Pat? I think he's might be having some technical difficulty, but I'm not sure. Thank you. At that point in time, the unprecedented times changed from excitement of a new funding stream to then us talking about unprecedented times related to a worldwide pandemic. And here we are, over 2 months later, and truly beginning to realize the impact of a health crisis on our economy. Agencies across the state have been asked to prepare for deep cuts. The governor directed us that way several weeks ago. We're bracing across the state for cuts deeper than we likely have seen before. All of that being said, this evening we're bringing to you a budget built on the $9 billion state school funding level. That was the target amount prior to the pandemic. Districts across the state are building their budgets on that number because at this point in time, it's truly the only number that we know. Everything else is speculation. We know the revenue forecast is indicating that there are very dire times ahead. But to be very clear about how to build a budget, what we know is that $9 billion funding level, and we recognize full well that it will not ultimately be at that level that we'll be entering into next school year. Very highly unlikely. But until the legislature meets for a special session, it's hard to know what that reality of the budget reductions will actually look like. In the meantime, our administrators have been engaging in activities to prepare for those drastic cuts, knowing that ultimately we will ask our association leaders and colleagues to join us in those conversations, as we have in all the past years where we have been presented with a budget reduction. Also, in the meantime, we're very diligently implementing spending restrictions across the district through the remainder of this academic year. We aren't referring to it as a freeze per se, because there are expenses that we must incur, for example, related to distance learning, as just one of a handful of examples. The impacts that the pandemic will have on our budget is unclear at this point, but in closing, I want to leave you with some thoughts that are crystal clear to me. Through all of the challenges, the obstacles, the barriers that we've encountered since March 13th, our staff, our teachers, our classified staff, our administrators have had a can-do attitude and have gone above and beyond time after time after time. Shifting gears very quickly from supplemental education to distance learning for all, creating distance learning from scratch, and then delivering the model, and a model that we'd only ever dared to imagine, but couldn't ever quite get our arms around until we were faced with it just over the course of the last couple of months. Our staff has packed up entire buildings in short order so that construction crews could get a jump start on the transformation projects. Now, so many of our staff members have been in, there are many of our staff members who have been in those classrooms for many, many years. Other staff members have been in just one building, one school for all of their career. And they were thrown very quickly into a situation to pack up not just their room, help with their building, and not really even have the opportunity to be given time to say goodbye, if you will, to that chapter in their careers. Our staff has been tending to the mental and emotional supports of our student, but it's while they're also dealing with their own fears and their own illnesses and feelings of isolation. Not to mention trying to teach from one's home while also taking care of their own children and their own families. Our staff, our teams have been providing and delivering hundreds of meals a day for some students in our district whose only square meals come to them through school. They've been deploying hundreds of iPads to elementary students and providing hotspots for families. Our teams have been creating graduation events that this week span over the course of 4 days. Today was the day for delivering the diplomas to those families who opted for that approach to their students' graduation. And our staff has been open and trusting enough to approve the passage of WorkShare in our district. And as you know, that's a cost savings approach where all of the employees in our district will be taking furlough days, specifically 10 furlough days for those of us who work year round and 4 for those who work a school year calendar. Huge sacrifices and all of these amazing bright spots and acts of kindness and encouragement and going above and beyond through all of the other pieces of uncertainty. Again, I share those examples just as just a few of so many of the rays of hope and the caring and the dedication that help me to know that whether we're talking about budget impacts or the care of our students, there is hope, and for certain, together we will persevere. So thank you for letting me share those thoughts. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Dr. Cordy. I'm going to go ahead and present a slide deck here. Give me one moment to get it started. And I would ask Christine, would you jump in and let me know if you're seeing it correctly or not?
Yes, I'm seeing it.
Fantastic. Thank you. First off, as you've heard both this evening from Dr. Cordy and also at the orientation, we recognize that this budget is likely to change. However, we do have, or I should say, you have the legal responsibility to pass a budget by June 30th. And that's why we're here tonight. And we know we will adjust this budget as we move forward, particularly because there's so many unknowns. You may ask, as members, will you be called back to review and approve changes? In the event the budget went up by more than 10%, then yes, we'd have to bring you back. If it's less than 10% increase or a decrease at all, the board may approve those changes to the budget. Ultimately, they could do that before adopting the budget later this month, or even after the budget's adopted, they can cut it or reduce it throughout the year. These are the topics we're going to cover tonight, with kind of the 3 primary factors affecting our budget: the state economic and revenue forecast, the legislative activity that's expected, and enrollment. And then lastly, we will conclude with our own planned response to these items. These roles and actions you heard Chair Pertowski mentioned them. Kind of the highlights I'd hit again is your job is to receive the budget message and the budget document from the superintendent, review that budget, and then allow the community to participate in this process. The two actions you have to take are approve the budget at the major fund and function level and set the tax rate. We shared our strategic plan and the equity lens during our our budget committee orientation in April. I just want to bring that to your attention again because it is board approved and what we use to guide our work and guide our budget planning process. And because equity is such a key goal and eliminating predictable disparities in achievement is so important to us, we use this set of questions. And it's in part because we recognize that not all of our students come to us having had the same access to resources and educational support. So we use these questions to help us determine if we are in fact meeting the needs of our students and that decisions we make are in the best interest of all our students. So we did receive the June revenue forecast on May 20th. Sadly, a gap of $867 million is still better than expected. It's a huge gap. The governor's directions originally was to plan for a $656 million reduction in the state school fund. With the forecast coming in slightly better, we've now been told the shortfall is approximately $490 million. Since we receive 0.8% of the state school fund, our share is approximately $3.92 million. Now we have contingency plans underway up to a $5.6 million amount. We've been emphasizing numbers between the 2.4 million and the $4 million range. And that $490 million again would be approximately 3.92 million. So our kind of early planning is right on target for that number. We still don't know related to the Education Stability Fund and Rainy Day Fund if the legislature will access those and how much. We've also been told to consider what we do if the student investment account, the SIA money, came in at about 37% lower than expected. The remainder would be enough to cover the backfill of positions from the general fund that we'd planned as part of our SIA money. The SIA is funded with the corporate activities tax. The first 580 million of that tax goes straight into the state school fund. This would leave approximately 593 million to fund the Student Success Act, including 296 million for the Student Investment Act for the 2020-21 school year. The SIA was designed to fund the work we did with stakeholders to identify our key needs across the district. It would have meant 34.5 positions added to the district, in addition to that backfill I just mentioned of about 1.3 million. And those positions would have helped address, again, the community directed work of social and emotional learning, student mental and behavioral health needs, and then broadening curricular offerings at all grade levels. Very important work that we were all very much looking for, the superintendent mentioned. The new challenge that came from the May revenue forecast is just the multi-year economic and budget impacts that they're expecting, nearly 10 billion between now and June of 2025. And the challenge for us is we don't know at this moment what planning horizon the legislature will select, if they will look at it short term or take a longer term view and look at it over the next few years. And again, that has to do with the state, the Rainy Day Fund and the Education Stability Funds. We also don't know when the legislature will convene. So we have some questions around that at this time. And we, of course, cannot predict what they will do once they do convene. But we do have a contingency process in place that would allow us to effectively and efficiently respond to those legislative actions. And that includes working both with administrators, and of course we'd work with our bargaining units to talk about what potential cuts might be necessary. In addition to this planning work, the district is working with state education leaders to take a vital and active role in a larger advocacy effort on behalf of schools. And they actually are collecting kind of the stories of what happens at the different cut levels. And so that work was turned in today by Phil Johansson. Again, as we discussed also at the orientation, we are facing enrollment projection shortfalls, and we had a plan to address these. We believe we were conservative last year in selecting 5108, and then we came in at 5,031 students, so significantly less. One of the questions that came up at our orientation meeting was, well, just how far short are we on those enrollment projections? And this document here, or this slide here, you can see previously in the fall of 2018, they had expected us to have 5,179 and a half students this coming fall. The new projection received this last fall, 2019, showed us down 161 students from that projection. And then by the time we get to 2022, that is nearly 275 students. So a significant shortfall for us. Again, Davis Demographics believes that in about 5 years, we'll be back to what is essentially the current enrollment projection for that year. So it's a short-term dip followed by growth again. And again, as you can see, even the fall of 2022, excuse me, shows us with approximately 140 students more than we have this year. So we do have growth over the next 2 years. It's just not nearly at the level that we had expected.
Jim, I believe we have a question from Chair Allen.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm only seeing my slides, and so I'm unable to see those. I'd be happy to answer questions. I would ask that if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me and ask away. And so, Chair Allen. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing anything. Is anyone else?
No, I'm not hearing him either.
I
Chair
hear you.
Allen, do you have a question?
No, not anymore.
Okay. So this is another way of looking at that slide or the data from that slide, in that we'd expected to add 310 students in a 3-year frame window from the fall 2018 report. The fall 2019 report shows us only adding 150. And so that delta of 160 students is a significant impact to our long-term projections, and one that we have to be paying attention to as we move forward. The other question I think that came up was, how is Davis Demographics thinking about COVID-19 and what impacts that will have on us? And they told us it's a bit early to tell, and they could actually make arguments to both sides of the enrollment question, which is it could, or response, which is it could go up or it could go down. They say down because home sales and housing starts may decline as people become uncertain about employment status and are hesitant to take on a mortgage. And also the developers are unlikely to start new homes if they aren't sure they will have buyers. Davis also suggested it could go up as people who have had their kids in private schools can no longer afford that. And so we could see an influx of new students from private schools. Essentially, they said it will take 5 to 6 months before they're able to estimate the true impact on next year's and future years enrollment, which is about the time we'd expect our next report from them. And so that will start to cover the data that they collect next fall. These are our key assumptions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did we have an update on the open slots at the high school? How that is going for those enrollment numbers?
Yeah, so the board had opened 45 slots. We've had 15 requests to transfer in. We are still hoping for more and looking at ways in which we can make sure that those slots are known by our communities.
Thank you.
Certainly. These are kind of the key assumptions. We started our budget process using the new Davis demographics projection of 5,018 students. And we're basing our budget on the last legislative number of $9 billion in the state school fund. On the expenditure side, we are planning on cost of living adjustment and medical benefit increases based on our current collective bargaining agreements. One of the key questions that always comes up is what are we expecting for ending fund balance or reserves? We expect at the end of 2021 to have reserves of about 3.3 million or 5.8% of expenditures. This is within that target of 5 to 10%. We'd love to be closer to the 10, but I'm still happy that we're at the 5%. In the meantime, as the superintendent mentioned, we have implemented some spending restrictions through the rest of the year to conserve any fiscal year 2019-20 resources that we can. And again, we also did implement furlough days, and we expect there will also be some savings with the closure of schools. The majority of that is coming from not needing substitutes, but there's also some savings in utilities and consumable supplies as well. Now, while the bond budget is not directly in the district general fund, it is important to see how we're doing. Presently, bond projects are in alignment with current budgets and nothing remains to be bid, so we're feeling very good about that. We are watching the impact of the pandemic on construction projects and just carefully monitoring that piece. In addition, our bond oversight committee of community members meets quarterly and carefully reviews that progress. After each meeting, they report directly to the board in person and also in written communication. Even though the bond work is outside the general obligation, or the general fund, excuse me, we are starting to make adjustments to the budget to make to utilize and maintain the additional 350,000 square feet of space. And so that means the proposed budget you have before you includes items like custodial needs, utility expenses, and insurance increases. And then these are the kind of remaining dates for the budget process. If we need, there will be an additional meeting on next Monday, and then a meeting on the 10th, and then the budget hearing and adoption by the board on the 24th. And with that, I will take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see folks if they have questions.
Could I make a comment?
Certainly.
I guess I feel like I need to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is nobody rational would actually try to adopt a budget right now. With the huge amount of uncertainty that's sitting out there, and not knowing whether there's going to be any kind of federal revenue aid to states, not knowing the willingness of the legislature to meet, let alone allocate reserves, and do they allocate reserves now versus saving them for later? A whole bunch of questions, and that if we were rational actors, we would wait until we knew some more of those pieces before we would try to do a budget. Unfortunately, the law says we have to have a budget by July 1st. And so, I think part of what we're challenged by is to sort of figure out how to communicate to people. Jim, you talked early on about, reconvening the budget committee if we have revenue up or down by certain percentages. I think what we need to really do is be transparent and talk about the fact that that's a certainty. There's just no way we're not going to need to come back together at some point before the start of the school year and potentially make significant adjustments to this budget. We just don't know enough today to be able to, to go out and project that and make those adjustments right now, particularly given the disruptions and things that follow from them if you make them now without having at least a little bit more complete a picture than we do today about what the budget is. I just feel like that's kind of a big driver of a lot of this, and wanted to kind of get that on the table.
I'd like to follow on if I could, if that's all right. I completely agree with Pat. I feel like of the many things of this year that just at both just are bizarre and feel like they need like 15 asterisks, this budget process ranks right up there with the rest of them. And I want to commend the staff for doing the best they can to build a budget based upon the only information that we have at the moment. Our state leaders that hold most of the cards on what our future looks like, and there are 197 other districts around the state all struggling with the same thing, having received no clear guidance from state officials at ODE, at the legislature, at the governor's office about what school districts should plan for, are using the only tool they have, which is to use the base budget. I would say that I also want to commend district staff for also being incredibly responsible and essentially imposing a spending frost, not a freeze, because there are immediate needs related to COVID and things that we're still required to do, but making wise decisions in order to preserve cash, knowing that the chances of us being able to proceed with this budget are, as likely as a vaccine being widely available in a week. It's just not going to happen. However, I would like for us to consider directing, as part of this budget process, and in recognizing that we have made these management decisions, and in sending a signal to the public that we're not just adopting a budget without recognizing the moment that we're in. It would be helpful if the district staff could develop for board consideration for when the board adopts this budget, another motion that deals with the management controls and formalizes those in a way that enables us to send a very clear signal to the community that while we're adopting this budget using the only metric that's available to us at the moment, or that is likely to be available to us by the time we meet again at the end of June, because the earliest they would come in is June 22nd, and that's looking real unlikely. So recognizing that we at least wrap this budget in another motion that makes it clear to the community, just because we've adopted this because we're required to by law, doesn't mean that we're going to spend as though we have a $9 billion budget. In fact, the district has been very proactive in managing costs. And I think sending that signal is really, really important to the community. And I think also makes it clear that we have also taken this kind of very odd situation we're in as seriously as we possibly can.
Thank you, Jessica. Any other questions or comments from the committee?
I think Will wanted to say something or had a question.
Yeah, I got a question if I could. I think I heard Jim saying that if the if the budget were to increase or revenues were to increase, I believe he said 10%, then the board would have to reapprove the budget. But if it decreased, there would not be a reapproval, which I think was a little bit different than what Paul had said or Pat had said.
I think great question. The way it works is if the budget increases more than 10%, this group, as the budget committee, has to be called back in to adopt a revised budget. If it's less than 10% or a decrease from the budget that's adopted, then the board has the statutory authority to make those changes directly. Does that help?
Yeah, can I say it in maybe the dummy terms that I might understand? So what we're asking for is a budget based on assumptions in a normal environment. And if we approve a larger budget and a smaller allocation of revenue comes from the state, you're authorized to spend less than what's approved.
Yes.
Okay. And sorry, and we're only making this this approval now because per legislation it is required to be approved by the end of the month.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
The reason that like 0 to 9% require, we'd still have to come back to the board, is that we have limitations as what's passed to what we can spend. And so the legislature has given boards the authorization essentially up to the 10% to make changes. And above that, then it requires this larger community process that includes the budget committee.
I'm not too terribly worried about having to manage for a scenario where we get more money than.
Yeah, that's highly unlikely, isn't it?
I would agree.
All right, I think Ryan had another question.
Yeah, so my question was just with regards to the timing. So if we looked at the calendar, Jen, that you'd put out in front of us, we want to adopt something today or maybe next week, right, if we need the meetings. Why wouldn't we wait until later in the month of June and then adopt something when potentially we could know more if there's a chance of us knowing more?
It's actually a timing issue with some of the legal requirements around publicizing the budget, and that you have to advertise it, I believe it's 2 weeks prior to adoption by the board. And so it backs us up from whatever date the board's meeting to these dates. And so we can't kind of push all these meetings till late in the month and do it very quickly because we have legal requirements to advertise it. I think our paper of record is actually the Oregonian. So we have to look at their publication dates and timelines to get that in. I think
put differently, we could push our meeting to adopt the budget until the very end of June, hypothetically, but that would basically only buy us 2 more weeks of knowledge. And I do think it's a logical question to ask, but I don't think it's very likely we're going to know much more in the next 2 weeks than we know today.
Thank you, Director. Sue, did you have a question as well?
My question is just, do we have any sense of what they might spend out of the rainy day fund, or do we have any idea of what? None.
Yeah, I have not heard any indication from we know what the legislature will do with either the rainy day fund or the education stability fund.
Okay, thank you.
So I was going to jump in and answer a little bit of Ryan's question, but to Stu's as well. I mean, what we're hearing, and I'm in asking these kind of questions every day and talking with the governor's office and others, but what we're hearing is a pretty wide disagreement between the House and the Senate about when they want to come in. The House is more than happy to wait for whatever Congress is going to do, and that timeline continues to slip. Congress is considering substantial state and local government resources as well as school district resources. If those come through, the decisions look very different and may come with a timeline to spend those resources either in the remainder of this biennium or perhaps into the following, which will then go into a longer conversation of, do you tap the resources now or and hold the money from the feds, or do you spend the Fed money now and then hold the state money for the next biennium when the cheese literally slips off the crackers? So they don't have a plan yet, because while the Senate wants to come in and start making decisions so that you're making decisions far enough out that the pain isn't quite as bad as when you wait, the House's perspective is, no, we need to wait so we know what the feds are going to do, so that if we can avoid making a cut, we do that now. There's a lot of interest in protecting K-12 as much as possible, but that also assumes that they're able to make the kinds of cuts in human services and in healthcare that become real painful when you try and do them, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So that's a long way of saying they have no plan yet. And are unlikely to have one until whatever Congress does, they do, and then it'll be a few weeks, which pushes us really into probably early July at the absolute earliest before they come in, which is why, you know, as crazy as this is, we still need to move now.
I think hand raised, but I'm not seeing it now. Anybody else have comments or questions?
I have a question, Tim. It's Roger.
Hi, Roger.
So it's not clear to me exactly what's driving the budget increases. I know you had indicated that there are some additional funds related to the new school, the capital project, the high school, etc. But it looks like the budget's going up about 8.5% and enrollment is going down. So that's a very strange message.
Part of that, Roger, is about a $3 million, almost $4 million increase in the student investment account that shows up in the special revenue fund. And that's the SIA money that we were expecting. We now expect it to be somewhat less than that, but we're not exactly sure yet. And a point I'd make there, just so everyone's well aware here, is while that money's there and it's budgeted for positions, we are not currently trying to fill those positions because of the uncertainty around funding. So we did hire a few green room instructional assistants, and so those were positions out of the SIA funding, but the vast majority of those 34.5 FTE that we referenced have not been filled and are not currently being recruited.
My vote would be to take some of those positions out of the budget.
So just as a reminder, part of the committee, we don't actually mandate positions. So we fund at a higher level than that. I think Ryan had a question or a comment.
Yeah, so if we're anticipating or we know that there's going to be a cut, right? We don't know if it's going to be 5% or 10% or maybe bigger. Can we put together what we would cut in those given situations because we know there's going to be a cut? I think it would help to see some visual of, if it's 5%, this is what it looks like. If it's 10%, this is what it looks like. If it's crazy and it's higher than 10, this is what we would target, right? So just to give us some type of an expectation, as we know that there's going to be some type of a cut.
Yeah, if I could comment, I think we don't know that there's going to be a cut, although it seems likely. But I do think that notion of some scenarios, 2 or 3 scenarios, 4 scenarios of what different levels of cut might look like would be a really useful exercise for us to do with the budget committee ahead of, at some point, taking actions when we have more information.
Pat, it's my understanding that the team has already worked on what some of those scenarios look like. So I think it may be useful for Jim and Phil and Heather to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah, we are working on some of those. We've not had those conversations outside of the administrator level. And we typically, from prior to my being a member of this staff, don't make those decisions without a lot of consultation with the board and with our employees and particularly our bargaining units. And so we are initially having some conversations again at the admin level, looking at what those cuts could be and trying to prioritize those. But we've not yet had the conversations outside of that group.
This is Heather. Just to add on to that, Ryan, I appreciate the question about that. And we have, to Jim's point, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to what Jim just explained, but just to kind of put an exclamation point behind it, we have spent many hours as an administrative team going as deep as 5.2 million in cuts, or 5.6. Like it's so horrific at that level. It's kind of a blur whether it was 5.2 or 5.6 in our last activity. But what that looked like was every level. So the high school, the middle level, the elementary, in addition to our operations team working separately and our teaching and learning team working separately as well, all engaged in an activity with very detailed directions about the levels that we needed them to hit in reductions and what those would be, and being able to rationalize the thinking behind those reductions. We then took, as an exec team, we then took all of those very painful bodies of work, and this last week and weekend was an assignment for each of us to prioritize individually how we would prioritize those 117 line items that came from each one of those groups, just so that we could keep the wheel turning, if you will, behind the scenes. But the greatest piece that I would want to give you as a takeaway is that notion. We have continued to explore that work behind the scenes, but to Jim's point, this isn't something that we want to necessarily trot out, in a public conversation, because we haven't had those conversations with our partners who are our associations, and that is always how we operate. Is when we get to the point where we are clear about what our target is, we bring them to the table and have those conversations with them. So it would be hard to imagine bringing just some of those brainstormed ideas into a conversation like this without betraying some of the trust or relationships that we've worked so hard to develop over the last decade plus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just one follow-up to that. So with the first thing that would be cut, is it staff? I didn't know if there was other things that would be cut first, but I know staff's a big expenditure, but would that be kind of the first place we would have to go?
One of the things that we talked about in this exercise is that there's no way we're going to trim the fat, to get to this level of reductions. And so that being said, just this morning, our core steering committee looked over the prioritization of those 117 odd line items. And I can't remember how deep we went in reductions before we actually got to the first FTE cut, but it was noteworthy, and it showed some really hard work and good thinking on the part of the team. Phil and Jim, I don't know if you remember how deep we went before we got to the first FTE, but I think it was noteworthy.
This is Jim. I think we were roughly about 55, 60 lines in, and in the $650,000 range of cuts before we started looking at FTE. Jake, you have a question?
Yeah, so that actually is impressive to get that far down, because as Ryan mentioned, salaries is usually one of the bigger expenses. Of all those line items, is there any insight into kind of which grade levels are the most impacted, whether it's high school, middle school, or elementary by those reductions?
That's a great question. And again, we are just now kind of prioritizing and haven't had a lot of conversations with the people that we need to. And this was a prioritization made by the executive team, which is most of the people you see here tonight, most of the staff members you see. And now I've lost you the question.
I've got it, Jim.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Jake, it's too early to tell. That's the bottom line answer there. But it's definitely going to be a consideration as we move forward, for sure, because that always enters into as those decisions are being made.
Okay, thank you.
And Roger, I'm not sure we addressed your comment maybe very directly. I understand and appreciate the desire to remove positions from the SIA to make the budget maybe more accurate. But at this point, we really don't know what the SIA funding, and for that matter, the state school funding will be. And so we have to pass a budget based on the known information that we've been provided. And that's it. It's kind of the elephant in the room that Pat's talked about. It's a weird thing that we're asking to do, but we do have to pass one on the information we have. And so that's why we're proceeding with this tonight.
Thanks, Jim. I do appreciate that. And I know there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this by the staff and everyone. And so I'm not trying to imply that it's a bad budget. It just feels like we're kicking the proverbial can down the road. My experience is that if you have to make hard decisions, and it feels like everyone is sort of acknowledging that there will yet be difficult decisions that need to be made. My experience is that the sooner you make them, the better. So kicking the proverbial can down the road doesn't really feel very good.
Yeah. Will, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. On the slide, there was a note about a $3 million reserve. What's the purpose of that, and is any of that available?
That's the reserve at the end of the year. It's our ending fund balance, and so the board has traditionally set a target of 10% ending fund balance, and that's to help deal with these kinds of situations where you have an economic downturn. They have, over the last couple of years, I shouldn't say we as a district have acknowledged that a 5% ending fund balance is, while not ideal, is a target we should achieve, with the 10% being our real target. So the fact that we're hitting about 5.8% is actually within that range that we would like to see.
Okay.
Does that help answer that?
Yep.
Okay. Sue, I think you had a question or comment.
I did. Just talking about the budget and personnel, we know personnel is about 85% of what we spend, around there, 83 to 85. But as much as we may end up having to lay people off. We don't know. It's so speculative. And you've alluded to that. And having gone through that process before, it's awful, it's emotional, it's, you know, it's a lose-lose all the way around. And if we can save a few additional jobs and not cause fear in a time where everyone's already fearful and scared, if we don't have to, it just makes sense to be really cognizant of that. And I think to be, you know, really empathetic to that plight. You know, I just don't want to do something that's completely speculative if we don't have to.
Thank you, Sue. Nicole?
And that's, I just wanted to kind of go back to what Dr. Cordy was saying, kind of what Sue just shared. One thing I appreciate so much about this district is how closely the staff and the board and the administration all work together. And while I would love to say, you know, well, let's pass this budget, but then we have A, B, and C. If you look and see that A is, you know, so many high school teachers, so many elementary teachers, then you start, you know, well, who is that? What grade level? That's where you start that speculation. And that's where I think you lose some of that trust that's been built. So while that makes sense from a numbers perspective and feels safer, I just wanted to acknowledge that I really appreciate what Dr. Cordy was saying, that erode some of those relationships. I think that's one thing that we all love and make sure what's so unique is that there is so much trust and cooperation between those parties. So I understand why that's the case, and I appreciate that.
Jessica, looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm ready to make a motion if folks are ready for that to happen. And I, again, just want to make a point. I'd like to add to this that having the board adopt recognition of the kind of cost controls that management has implemented so that we can not only assure ourselves, but assure the community that even though we're required to move forward with a budget, absent the best information available, absent information that will become available after the budget deadline, that we are still making very prudent decisions as a district not to move forward with spending that we don't know if it's going to be there or not. So I'd like to make a motion if it's appropriate at this time.
Before Jessica does that, Chair Brutowski might want to check in and see if there are public comments.
Yep.
There are no public comments submitted at this time.
All right, if you're ready, Madam Chair.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was having problems unmuting. Yes, I was going to make sure that we had no public comments. So thank you, Dr. Allen. Now that that's been covered, if there are no more, I think we're ready.
Okay, I would move that the Budget Committee approve the proposed budget for 2020-2021 school year as submitted by the superintendent, with the direction to the staff to bring forward a supplemental motion for the board's consideration around cost and management controls as the board considers this motion on June 24th.
Okay. It has been moved. All of those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I need a second on that motion.
I'll second. Could I make a quick comment to the motion?
Second.
Yep.
I just, I want to, I'm sorry, May I?
Yes.
I just want to acknowledge Roger's comment about kicking the can. I've done painful budget cuts before, and I really agree with that sentiment. I think the distance that we're kicking the can is relevant here, however, and we're not talking about kicking it so far down the road that we make a problem worse later, in a later budget than we're dealing with here. I think we're simply trying to kick it far enough down the road to have enough information to make a better decision, but I don't think that's later than about August before we actually have to take those steps. So I think painful cuts, if they're going to happen, will come plenty quick. And so, like I say, how far you're kicking the can, I think, is relevant, and that's why I would support this motion.
Okay, and I did have a second, correct?
Yes, Pat was second.
Okay, so it's I have a motion and a second. All of those in favor say aye.
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 Okay, and any opposed? All right, with that, I would say the motion is carried and it has been approved.
Okay, you ready for another motion?
Yep.
Okay. Madam Chair, I move to approve the 2020-2021 levy of the district's permanent rate of 4.8123 per $1,000 of assessed value and $14,751,207 for debt service.
All right, do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, I have a few seconds. It's been moved and seconded. All of those in favor say aye.
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 All right, any opposed? All right, the motion carries. That is both the proposed budget and the tax. So those are our action items. And with that, that means that our upcoming budget committee meetings would not be needed. And so we have concluded our business and we are set. So I just appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for the work you've done. And I know this is kind of a weird medium to conduct this on, but it's good to see you all. And I'm glad that we were able to get this all wrapped up. Anything else before we close?
Thanks for ably serving as our chair.
I do my best. Okay, Christine, anything else before we close up the meeting in the live stream?
Nope,
I just need to adjourn.
Nope, I believe that covers it.
Okay, so with that, I adjourn our budget meeting. Thank you guys so much.